what really sets Juneteenth apart is that it is meant to be a party. It is meant to be a joyful, raucous celebration. It takes place in the summer. People would have parades, picnics, barbecues. The way that you celebrate freedom is by eating delicious food and listening to music and, dancing.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello, my name is Jared Monshine, and welcome to another episode of the USSC Briefing Room. I'm the Director of Research at the US Space Center, and today we're doing an episode on Juneteenth. But before we get started, I first want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So to help me understand Juneteenth, I have a USSC researcher by the name of Catherine Schumacher, who is a senior lecturer in American Studies at the US Study Center, and she holds a PhD in U.S. History from the University of Chicago and a BA in American Studies from Northwestern University. And her work explores the intersection of race and gender in American law. And we were talking about Juneteenth because it's obviously coming up this month, but it's also a recent holiday. It was only made a federal holiday by the Biden administration a few years ago. And a lot of folks, myself included, did not hear as much about Juneteenth until we were older. And I'd love to get into the history of Juneteenth, why it's a holiday, and how it became a holiday and the significance of it with someone who knows this well. Now, before we get to Juneteenth itself, I first would love to hear from you, Katie, on your background in terms of why you do the work you do, and why, especially having spent so much time in Chicago, why Chicago style pizza is better than any other type of pizza.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks for having me on the show today. I am a legal historian, so I'm very interested not just in big questions of law, but things like the US Constitution and legislation, but I'm really interested in ordinary people and how ordinary people experience legal change and how they come into interaction with legal institutions. So I'm currently finishing a book. It's actually due Monday. I'm very close to being done with it. That is a history of interracial marriage during this era of racial segregation in Mississippi. And this is a story that is one that most people think didn't happen, because there's a sense that because interracial marriage was illegal, that people didn't actually form families that crossed the color line. But what I found as a course of my research is that for ordinary people, men, they had this idea that they had the kind of authority to govern the home, and that even extended in some cases to having common law wives that were Black. So it looks at these families and how they grow out of emancipation and follows them through the Jim Crow era. So I'm very interested in, again, these kinds of questions, like how did emancipation affect everyday people? And that's really what Juneteenth is all about, and the kind of origin of the holiday.
Perfect segue. You teed it up perfectly. So yeah, can you just then tell us, like, what is Juneteenth, and the sort of history of it, and how it became, why it's called Juneteenth, and why it's become a holiday?
Sure. So a question that historians for generations have loved to debate is this question of who freed the slaves. And most people today would say the slaves freed themselves, but that often had to do with the spread of information. So, of course, when we think about the emancipation of slaves in the United States, people point to January 1st, 1863, which is when Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation became law. Of course, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free everyone who was enslaved in the United States. It didn't apply to the border states who didn't secede. The 13th Amendment, of course, didn't become part of the US Constitution until the end of 1865. So the process of emancipation was one that was very localized, and that was often drawn out and highly contingent on circumstance. And one of the big circumstances that dictated whether or not people understood and claimed their own freedom was the movement of the Union Army.
Can I just ask the Emancipation Proclamation? Could you briefly give our audience a quick intro on what that is or why that was significant and when that occurred, just on the going along with what you were just mentioning on the Union Army?
So the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln in the autumn of 1862. And the context was that, of course, the Civil War was already in full swing. The Confederate States had seceded from the Union a year before. And what was happening was that where the army went, enslaved people would run away to freedom at Union lines. And this started happening basically as soon as the Union Army marched south. And these enslaved people, their status was a bit for debate, right? Because the Union Army didn't employ slaves, but there was an argument to be made that they were contrabands of war. And so the Army developed this policy where any enslaved people who ran away to Union lines would be welcome, but they would not be enslaved. But most of them did end up working for the Union Army. And these were called contraband camps. They often had whole families. Initially, it was adult men who ran away, but they were soon joined by women and children. And these contrabands, these are free people who then would do things like do the washing for the Union Army. They would cook food. They would, take care of Union soldiers. And of course, many of the enslaved men who ran away actually became soldiers once Black men were allowed to join the Union Army. So the progress of the Army often spurred people who were on plantations who were being held in slavery to run away. And sometimes from a short distance, sometimes from a long distance, but it often meant that freedom was quite dispersed throughout the South, and it really depended on whether people knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, which then comes, strategically as an act of war, because Abraham Lincoln understands that enslaved labor was essential to the success of the Confederate Army, and that, of course, enslaved people had been effectively conscripted to work for. So, Confederate soldiers would bring along enslaved people, usually men, to help them. And so they're being used to support this rebellion against the United States. And so Lincoln justified the Emancipation Proclamation as a way really to weaken Confederate forces, but via this argument that, these enslaved people are property that's being used to wage war. Therefore, the Union Army can claim them for its own effectively. So that was a kind of argument that they're both people and property, but that they can then become free.
And so then you were saying,
Yes, yes. But word, one of the things that's kind of incredible about people who study slavery and study the experience of slavery during the Civil War, even, there are lots of books on all of this. I'd be happy to offer some suggestions for further reading for people who are interested. But rumor and whisper networks were very powerful in terms of spreading information from plantation to plantation over sometimes great distances. And so it wasn't always the case that people didn't know that they were free until the army approached. It might be the case that they had heard rumors about the Emancipation Proclamation, but it was the army's approach that allowed them to escape to freedom. So what kind of happens is that the Union Army obviously wages this huge effort to retake the Mississippi River, knowing that it's really central to the progress of the war, but also to Confederate supply lines. And once the Union Army takes control of the Mississippi River in 1863, they then push eastward, and that's the story of Sherman's March to the Sea. Of course, Juneteenth is all about what's happening west of here, which is a bit of a more complicated story because the Civil War in the West involved Native American tribes. It involved, these skirmishes that are happening in places that we don't often think of as the kind of classic Deep South. But of course, the Civil War took place, as far as, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but also in places like Georgia, and then, of course, even places like Texas.
and could you maybe explain? It wasn't. It was occurring even with Native Americans. What exactly are you referring to there?
So some of the tribes who had been relocated forcibly to Indian Territory prior to the Civil War. So we're talking about Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies. Some of those tribes, in their efforts to assimilate into kind of white American culture, adopted plantation slavery as one of their means of agriculture. And so, in fact, some of those tribes enslaved Black people and took them with them actually to Indian Territory. There's some ongoing debates over, for example, the Cherokee freedmen and their status even today in the 21st century in the Cherokee Nation. So there were a lot of complications when we think about the fact that the United States is not just black and white. There are other racial groups involved. White people are not the only people who owned slaves in the 19th century, and so this battle west of the Mississippi involved some of these tribes who fought on the side of the Confederacy, in part in this context of thinking, they'd already been treated quite poorly by the US federal government. So part of this calculation is thinking about, maybe we'll be able to get more out of the Confederate government if the Confederates prevail, but also this shared interest in human capital and people as property. And so that helped informed what's happening in the West. And in Texas itself, Texas had its own long history of slavery that goes back even before Texas was part of the United States. So there's this longer struggle in places like Texas over these questions of slavery, of freedom, that actually go back to the era when Texas was Mexico.
And so Juneteenth then comes around or becomes prominent because basically slaves in Texas had not been reached by the Union Army. Is that right?
So the story of Juneteenth is that General Lee, he surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia.
That's Confederate General Robert E. Lee.
Exactly.
Yes.
He surrenders April 9th, 1865, but the troops fighting in the West didn't know about the surrender immediately. We had telegraphs in the 19th century, but it took a while for news of the surrender to spread. And so there were still Civil War battles that took place after Lee's surrender. And some of these battles took place in places like Texas. And so it wasn't until June of 1865 that the Union Army sent a couple thousand troops to Texas to basically enforce the Union victory and the war there. And of course, along with that meant the emancipation of slaves. So the Juneteenth holiday commemorates the reading by General Gordon Granger of what was called General Order Number 3, which kind of repeats what was already in the Emancipation Proclamation, which is that there would be no slavery in the United States and that the Confederacy had lost the war. So I think it's probably not accurate to say that no one in Texas knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm actually certain that that's the case. Of course, people are traveling between states, armies are traveling. There is knowledge of the end of slavery, but whether or not you can claim that as an enslaved person was really contingent on whether or not it would be enforced. And so the arrival of Union troops who are there to actually ensure that enslaved people will be treated as free people is really the kind of milestone that Juneteenth, June 19th really commemorates.
And so then this is a significant period in Texas history. But what happened after June 19th of that year to those slaves? What is their process moving forward? Because it seems like in the U.S. education, the American education that I got, I know there was a lesson on the Civil War. There's a little bit about Reconstruction, and then we go to maybe Civil Rights Act, right? There's a lot of stuff that happens beyond that. So what happens after June 19th?
So it was quite a protracted struggle to actually ensure that free people would remain free. And a big part of the story in the wake of Juneteenth, in the wake of the Union victory, of course, has to do with Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And his vice president was Andrew Johnson, who himself had been a slaveholder. He was a Southerner. He was not by any means an abolitionist. He had, been chosen really for kind of political reasons to join Lincoln's ticket. And Andrew Johnson wanted to create terms that would allow the Southern states to re-enter the Union that were so generous that they would effectively allow all of these former Confederates who had engaged in a rebellion against their own government to take back the reins of their state governments. And people understood that this was actually quite a perilous situation for, a nation that had just witnessed this brutal civil war that killed millions of people. That if the terms of the peace didn't guarantee that conflict was resolved, and specifically the conflict over slavery, there was no reason to necessarily believe that there wouldn't be another war, that this issue wouldn't keep flaring up. So there was a lot of concern in Congress about Andrew Johnson, about his kind of kid glove treatment of these former Confederates, and this concern that these formerly enslaved people would not necessarily have guaranteed freedom. And so there was an effort to impeach Andrew Johnson that was supposedly about this Tenure of Office Act, that was really about this understanding that he was too conciliatory toward the rebellious states. There was also an effort, of course, to replace him with a stronger president. There was an effort to, mainly in Congress, to pass legislation that would protect freed people. And that was in part as a result of what happened after the end of the Civil War, which was that these Southern state legislatures, full of unreconstructed Confederates, wrote state constitutions that, effectively abolished slavery, but that created this system of really unfree labor. So they would do things like, so in Mississippi, for example, they would require that enslaved people go back to the plantations where they had been enslaved and work on those plantations under these really exploitative contracts. And if you refused to work, you would be declared a vagrant and you could be arrested, and then you could be compelled to work the convict lease system. So this was a system that a lot of people understood to just be replicating slavery. And so trying to get rid of that system of kind of these, they were called the Black Codes, these laws that were passed by Southern states after the Civil War, was a struggle that took until 1866, when Congress finally enacted what was called the Civil Rights Act, which was actually the first time in federal law that the US government said that if you are born here, you are a citizen. So this 1866 Civil Rights Act, prior to the 14th Amendment, which wasn't ratified until 1868, actually ensured that freed people were US citizens. And of course, this is significant because Dred Scott v. Sanford, which was the infamous 1857 US Supreme Court decision, in which Chief Justice Roger Taney stated that Black people had no rights that white men were bound to respect. So the Civil Rights Act was really important because it made those laws, those Black codes, unenforceable, and then also helped guarantee the rights of freed people by making them US citizens for the first time in American history.
Wow, that is quite a journey. And it's so great. I love when we bring on, I guess you are a political scientist by training, but a proper legal historian who knows the not only the names but the dates as well. So I guess that brings me then, in terms of the genesis of Juneteenth and why it became a holiday. We can talk about, there's the Biden administration component of it, but then how did it become a known holiday? I was a child of the 90s, and I remember hearing little bits of it, but not a lot until I was older.
Yeah, so Juneteenth has been celebrated since 1866, so since the first year anniversary of the reading of that general order in Texas. And for a long time, Juneteenth was very much a kind of local or regional holiday. So it was celebrated all over Texas. It was also celebrated in kind of nearby places like Oklahoma, but it didn't have a kind of national resonance, especially insofar as a kind of acknowledgement, right? Especially with what we've seen with Congress making it a federal holiday in 2021. That really came about 30 years ago, so in the 1990s, amid these efforts to, I guess you could think of it as almost like a second wave of the civil rights movement. We had, of course, the movement of the 60s and figures like Martin Luther King Jr. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was a new wave of leaders. And one of the big uh, calls during that era was this idea of diversity and representation. And so we saw a lot of, this is when Oprah comes to prominence. So having really prominent Black pop culture figures, thinking about sports and representation in sports, kind of a celebration of someone like Michael Jordan as a national hero. And so this idea that representation was a meaningful form of progress was something that was really characteristic of the 1990s and even into the early 2000s. And so I think the, kind of more general recognition of Juneteenth um, came about in part as a response to that. So there was more of an embrace, this idea that it was important to have, representation on the calendar of holidays. We have Independence Day, July 4th, celebrating, American independence from Great Britain. But we didn't have a holiday to celebrate independence within the United States and the end of slavery. And so there was a push to make Juneteenth a federal holiday that really found purchase during the 1990s and the early 2000s. I think then bore fruit in 2021 because of Black Lives Matter, because of this effort. I think Black Lives Matter protesters would say that representation is not enough, that equity is more important, and that kind of justice, but that this kind of 90s vision of representation. So we also see the rise of Kwanzaa. So Kwanzaa was a holiday that was invented in 1966. So it really is kind of 100 years after Juneteenth. But Kwanzaa, tried to seek a sort of holiday specifically that is about Black Americans, that is trying to find a kind of non-Anglo, non-European kind of winter celebration. So linking it up with kind of harvest celebrations in Africa, this idea really comes out of the kind of Black power activism of the 1960s and 1970s. But Kwanzaa and Juneteenth, the kind of awareness of them, the production of books about these holidays, so children's literature, kind of popularization really comes about during that era, which I think then paved the way for federal recognition just a few years ago.
That's a great point about independence from the Brits, but not independence from being slaves. But I guess some criticism was that there's already a holiday celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. and his birthday. Why should there be yet another holiday celebrating freedom and equality? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So Martin Luther King Jr., the federal holiday uh, commemorating his life and his legacy, is actually also a relatively recent vintage. So it was, I think, 86 that Congress finally voted after a very long, prolonged struggle. I don't know when the last time you've been to a Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration, Jared. Maybe it's been since you were living in the United States. I know at my former university where I worked in the U.S., we had commemorations every year. The tone of Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebrations tends to be very serious and very somber. And there's a seriousness about it in terms of trying to understand the struggle, civil rights movements, not just its victories, but also its kind of unfinished aspects. There's also an aspect where specifically the "I Have a Dream" speech has been, in some cases, used counter to what the King's values were. So the idea of colorblindness, that was what Martin Luther King Jr. wanted, doesn't accurately reflect his vision, especially when we look at his activism around anti-poverty work, the war on poverty, his Poor People's Campaign, but especially his critiques of the war in Vietnam as a kind of war against poor people of color globally, but also using many soldiers of color from the United States. So, kind of King's radical vision, some people felt has been a bit worn down by some of these celebrations. But I would say, one of the key differences here and what really sets Juneteenth apart is that it is meant to be a party. It is meant to be a joyful, raucous celebration. It takes place in the summer. People would have parades, picnics, barbecues. The way that you celebrate freedom is by eating delicious food and listening to music and dancing. And this also, of course, made many, especially white segregationists, very critical of Juneteenth, right? Because they would say, use it to kind of validate their racist caricatures of Black people as shiftless, as not wanting to work. But from the African American perspective, this is meant to be a celebration. It's meant to be a kind of joyous reflection on what it means to be free and the monumental effort that it took to establish and ensure freedom for everyone in the United States. That should be something to celebrate. It shouldn't be something to just observe with speeches or days of service, right? Like people should be able to party to celebrate something that's truly wonderful. And that the spirit of Juneteenth is very different than the spirit of how Martin Luther King Jr. Day is celebrated and commemorated.
My final question for you, Katie, you flagged this earlier, is that you have some books that you think are relevant for today's conversation. Do you mind sharing them with us?
Yes. So the thing I would encourage really anyone to read if they're curious about Juneteenth specifically is Annette Gordon Reed, who's written these magnificent histories of Thomas Jefferson. She's also written about his relationship with Sally Hemings, whom he enslaved.
And had children
Annette
with.
Gordon Reed, yes, 6 children. They had six children. Annette Gordon Reed wrote a book called On Juneteenth, which came out quite recently. And it's really a fascinating book because it does get into this history, the history of slavery in Texas, of Texas as a place, as a really significant and unique place in American history. But it's also quite a personal history. She integrated the white elementary school in her hometown in Texas. And she tells the story of what that was like. She talks a lot about the community, about family. It's just a really fascinating read. And it's a kind of short, beautiful capsule history that gets into so much material that's so wonderful. She talks a bit about lynching, just about kind of what it was like to grow up in the Jim Crow South and experience the end of segregation. So that's a really fascinating read. In terms of other histories of the Civil War, there's a wonderful book about the Civil War in the West called Three Cornered War, which is by Megan Kate Nelson. That's specifically really about this military history about the Civil War in the West. And then there's a fantastic history of civil rights by Kate Mazer, which is called Until Justice Be Done, which is this history of Black activism around Black freedom that takes you from prior to the Civil War through the Civil War and into those debates over freedom. It's really readable. It's really wonderful.
At that juncture, I would love to get your stat or figure. Sorry to ambush you with this one, but one thing we do on our podcast is we try to ask our guests to give us a stat or figure that is relevant to today's conversation. Do you by chance have one to share with us?
So my figure would be 250,000. And that is the number of people who were enslaved in Texas at the end of the Civil War, which, given that there were 4 million enslaved people in all of the US South prior to the outbreak of the war, I think tells us that the story of slavery is much bigger and much further west than people realize. It's a really complicated history, but that's part of the reason I find it so fascinating.
And you've only made me more fascinated to learn more about this and providing helpful nuance on this period of American history where I think not enough people know just how complex the dynamics were. So thank you so much for this great conversation. As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest from the U.S. Studies Center. Our CEO, my boss, Mike Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard with Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I also want to recommend checking out our USSC Live podcast series, which runs recordings from our major live events, including our Election Watch events. You can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, Katie.
Thanks for having me.